Hey, what's up, everyone? How you doing? It is me, Mr. 4K Upscaler, and this is one of those videos that I like to call HDR Breakdown. First, we're gonna start here with Alien. I already did Black Hawk Down. This is a second 4K HDR movie from Ridley Scott, and thankfully, Ridley Scott movies are being remastered and transferred in the best possible way. What's the point of these videos? I think I already mentioned this on my previous video. The whole point of these videos is for me to show you, for those of you who are interested in HDR, or maybe you are on the fence about the HDR, or you are a movie lover who is thinking about jumping into the HDR. I think this video will help you, or at least convince you as to why you should invest into the HDR. Okay, currently you are looking at the HDR here. This is the HDR running on my OLED E8 via my Oppo UDP203. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how this movie looks without HDR. Currently, this is on HDR. Okay, and I have a little button here that I can switch between HDR off and on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip the HDR on this scene, so just you guys can see uh, how much you are losing when you don't implement the HDR onto a film. So I'm going to go ahead and strip off the HDR on this scene really quick. All right, so this is HDR. What you're looking at right now, it's HDR, high dynamic range, and everything looks natural. There's a depth of picture here for such an old movie. The colors are represented in a way that the filmmaker intended, obviously. So let's strip off the HDR really quick. Now, this is without HDR. Uh, the colors, the color gamut, it's something that you can see. It's being stripped off. And if you have never experienced HDR, if you have never seen the color gamut, and much better contrast ratio, much better digital black levels, and much higher peak brightness, if you never experienced that on HDR, so you will probably think this is acceptable. This is how the movie should be, and this is how you remember watching this movie. But let's go back to the HDR. Let's see what kind of difference we got over here when we turn the HDR back on. Let's turn it on right now. And look at that. Look at the HDR here. That's what HDR does. It brings more of a natural picture. Now everything looks scary because they are in this spaceship where there's dimmed lights. It's not like they're like in a big arena. So it's a lot of there's a claustrophobic feeling about this movie. And Ridley Scott wanted this movie to feel claustrophobic, dark, and that was the tone of the movie that he wanted. Okay, let's move on to another scene here. Now, graphic warning here. This is that famous chest burst scene that we all remember from 1979. For those of you who are my age, for my generation, you remember this scene. Uh, Now, this is the way the filmmaker envisioned this movie to look, to have this tone of color, and HDR really brings that graphic scene on the kitchen table in this movie. It brings that scene really even more graphic. And this is with the HDR. Obviously, you can see the colors, the tone of colors, the way they should be. Uh, so everything looks nicely redefined. Now let's turn off the HDR. Let's turn it off. Let's see how it looks without HDR. It just doesn't look the way the movie should. There's no depth of picture. Everything looks two-dimensional. It doesn't look three-dimensional. Even the blood looks like tomato ketchup. It doesn't look redefined. Again, the whole point of this video is to show you what you are missing if you never step into high dynamic range, if you never bought a 4K HDR television, a really good 4K HDR television. It's also important to remember you got to have a really good 4K HDR television to appreciate what the 4K HDR can do. So, if you've been watching DVDs and VHS and Blu-ray like this, and you never experienced HDR, so you think, okay, this is the way it should be. This is how you remember it. Well, let's switch back to HDR. Oh, look at that. Look at the HDR here. Night and day, dude. Night and day. Night and day. Without the HDR, stripped metadata, it just looks as if you stripped the entire color gamut. That's what it looks like. You stripping that color gamut totally away from the movie and stripping that contrast ratio away from the movie. Everything looks bleak, and it's just it's difficult to go back to watching this movie without HDR. Let's turn the HDR back on. I think it's self-explanatory. I really hope that you guys watch these videos, and for those of you who are on the fence, I hope that you understand what's the point of HDR and why it's HDR so important. Because I don't know how else to explain it to you other than just show it to you. Let's move on to a next scene. The next scene is going to be very gruesome, so just bear with me here. This movie is rated R. Okay, so this is a HDR scene right here. This is the HDR scene, that gruesome scene. Look at the blood. The blood looks the way it should be, dark red. It's not like a ketchup syrup, it looks dark red, and that's how it is most of the time. Um, if you want to, if you, I don't know, if you never seen the blood, I mean, if you work in a clinic in a medicine, maybe you have seen the blood and how it looks. And the HDR and the tone that's being presented here, everything looks three-dimensional. See, this is the whole point here. The HDR brings you that three-dimensional depth of picture that you would not see otherwise without it. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to strip away the HDR here, and you will see just how awful it's going to look. Let's strip off the HDR. It's almost like you're watching like a different movie. But again, if you never seen HDR, you think this is okay. I mean, this is how the movie looks. Well, let's turn it back on. Let's turn the HDR back on. I mean, look at that. Look at that. It's just night and day. It's like night and day difference. I personally cannot go back watching this movie without HDR. It's just impossible. Here we go, yet another scene. And this is HDR. You can see clearly that the HDR brings us that depth of picture. Everything in the background. Tom Skerritt here, Sigourney Weaver. You feel as if you are there because it has that depth of picture, and that's what HDR does. It brings that natural tone of picture quality. Uh, this is with the HDR. Well, let's turn off the HDR. Let's just strip it off and let's see what we're going to get. I mean, look at this. I didn't even edit this. I just wanted to show it to you guys like this. Now, let me go ahead and let me pause the video. Let me show it to you again right now. The HDR, it's on. HDR, it's off. HDR, it's on. HDR, it's off. HDR, it's on. And clearly you can see the difference. Let's move on to a next scene. Same goes with this scene. There's a depth of picture here. Uh, Everything looks the way it should. And this is the way, again, the film director envisioned this movie to look. And now with the HDR, that's possible for you to see the movie the way it should look, especially if you have the OLED. If you have the OLED and you got 4K HDR player and you're watching this movie on the OLED with the HDR and 4K or Dolby Vision, you're just going to appreciate this movie the way it was meant to be seen. But let's strip off the HDR. Let's strip it off. The only thing you can see is that the color gamut has been stripped off, and that's the only thing that the camera can depict. But it just doesn't look nowhere as it should be. It doesn't have that depth of picture. It looks kind of bleak. And again, if you've never seen HDR, you would think, okay, well, this is how it is. This is how this movie was filmed, right? That's what I thought too, till 2015, 2016, when I first started getting into the HDR. Then I realized, oh, this is what it's all about. But let's turn the HDR back on. Let's do it. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Everything looks more natural. The color's being implemented properly. It looks the way it should be. Let's go to the next scene. And even here, I think this is a great scene right here where you're truly going to appreciate the advantage of the HDR. And I think you're going to see this advantage on the Batman movie, which I'm also going to do a breakdown on. We're talking 1989, Tim Burton's Batman movie. You will see how much high dynamic range adds to the Joker's face. Kim Basinger, Michael Keaton in the movie, uh, the tone of movie that Tim Burton wanted to implement in the Batman 1989 Batman, you will see just how much, you know, HDR really helps. And it's no exception on this film, obviously, in Ridley Scott film. Like I said, if I had Ridley Scott sitting here with me watching this, he would say, yeah, of course, leave the HDR on and leave it on the OLED. This is how he wants you to see the movie. But let's strip off this HDR. Remember, the whole point of these videos is for me to convince you, for those of you who are still on the fence, or for those of you who still haven't thought about maybe purchasing a 4K HDR television, and maybe why you should invest into HDR, especially if you're a movie lover. If you're a movie lover, this is something you really should consider. So let's strip off the HDR here, shall we? Now this is without HDR, and everything looks kind of bleak, looks kind of like two-dimensional. It doesn't have any depth to it. And again, it looks like a DVD, Blu-ray version. Again, if you've never seen HDR, then you're going to think, well, this is how I remember this movie. This is your point of reference. This is your memory of reference. It's seeing it like this. Well, my job here is to show you, well, this is what you've been missing now, the fact that it has HDR. Well, let's bring the HDR back on. Let's do that. Well, look at this. Look at this. Night and day. HDR on. HDR off. HDR on. HDR off. HDR on. I think even through this video you will be able to see that difference. Let's move on to another scene, shall we? And I love this scene. You can see Balaji Imperial. You can see everything looks three-dimensional. Looks as if I can grab this coffee. Like I can grab it. No, seriously, like I can grab it, pick it up, and drink it. The HDR brings depth of picture, three-dimensional depth of picture. And this is what you get with the HDR. Now you're experiencing this movie in a much, much better detail. Okay? But let's strip the HDR off. Let's turn the HDR off. Let's see what we got. Everything looks two-dimensional, looks bleak. And again, this is your reference of memory. This is how you remember this movie, watching it like this. So for you, it's something that's acceptable because this is how you remember the movie. But let me introduce you to HDR. Let's turn it back on. The HDR is turned back on. The colors pop. You're getting the color gamut. You're getting a much better contrast ratio here. The digital black levels and the white digital levels. Everything looks more consistent. Everything looks more three-dimensional. Okay, and I think this video will speak for itself, and that's the whole point of me doing this HDR breakdown, because it's really, I thought about this idea. I was like, what's the best way for me to convince you to at least think about maybe purchasing the HDR movies? And I thought about doing videos like this, and I think this is the best way to do it, to show you. For those of you who are skeptical about the HDR, for those of you who say, oh, HDR doesn't add anything, HDR doesn't do anything, well, here it is. But also remember this, you can't buy a cheap HDR television like Philips or Hisense, something $300, $400. You can't expect to see that dramatic picture quality and what the HDR has to offer if you purchase something that's very, very cheap. You need to consider TCLR 617. That's a good way to start with TCLR 617. That's a good introduction to 4K HDR. And then you can consider the QLED from Samsung. You can also consider Sony, Vizio, Quantum Series. But if you really want to appreciate the movies with HDR and 4K, I think OLED is truly that best option. If you're a movie lover, I think OLED, look no further than OLED. I mean, OLED is truly going to give you that, the way the movie should look, that quality. Don't worry about the burn-in. Here I am. I'm doing these videos. I'm showing it to you, and I haven't had any issues with the burn-in, guys. Burn has been exaggerated. Yes, there's possibility of burn-in, but LG, it's doing every year they're advancing their television panels to make sure that they can avoid that burn-in a little bit better. Let me show you one more scene, and then I'm gonna end this video. And this is another great example here on this scene right here. I mean, look at Tom Skerritt, and this is 1979, man. This movie, it's as old as I am, 40 years for such an old movie. And look at definition of his jacket, even the gray hairs on his beard. But this is what HDR does. It gives that depth of picture, that depth of three-dimensional picture. And this is why it's important that you have a really good television, OLED, and a really good 4K player like Oppo or Panasonic, and then buy a 4K HDR Alien 40th Anniversary Edition movie or any 4K HDR movie out there, and you will see drastic difference. Let's strip off the HDR really quick. Let's strip it off. It looks bluish. It looks bleak. It looks two-dimensional. It just, I can't watch it like this. And believe me, it looks even worse when you see this in person. The camera, my camera, can't even depict just how horrible this looks without HDR. But let's turn the HDR back on. I mean, look at this. Look at this, man. It's like night and day. It's much better difference right here that you're seeing. And that's what HDR does. It brings that tone, natural tone of color and the contrast, so you can see the contrast ratio between digital black levels and white digital levels, and then color gamut, of course. And if you have a really good TV like OLED with a good peak brightness, well, there you go. You're going to enjoy this movie. So I hope that this kind of, and I'm trying to do these series. I really want to do these videos to just to give you a sense of what you were missing and maybe why you should purchase the HDR version of this movie. Well, there you have it. I hope you guys enjoyed this 20-minute video. HDR plays a huge role in movies and video games as well. Pretty much every content out there. Well, there you have it. This is the HDR breakdown of Alien 40th Anniversary Edition, and thank you for watching. And I hope this video was informative. Take care.